So in the final one of our lectures, we're looking at appropriation. And it's quite fitting in the last lecture that we come full circle to the beginning. At the very start of the course, we were looking at how Pablo Picasso was maybe famous for using or stealing the phrase, great artists steal and bad ones imitate. We're looking at an example of an African mask that Pablo Picasso appropriated in the creation of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon of 1907. Just running back to the mask for a second, at the very end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th, Africa and other Asian countries, parts of the world, India, had been opened up greatly by trade. And this was, of course, because of advanced economics and things like the railway train and shipping lines and disposable income that people were having in Europe and wanted to have goods like this purchased for themselves. So people were buying African masks in local markets, and Picasso saw this while he was in Spain and France and appropriated that into his painting Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is a proto-cubist work that he did. It's a large-scale painting. Actually, he never sold it or rarely showed it to people. It was left in his studio. I think he tried to exhibit it once and it wasn't favorably received, but it is actually very cutting edge because of the way he's fragmenting and chopping up the bodies in these angular and very abstract shapes. He does it as well to the drapery. And in doing that, he also appropriates on the African mask motif, particularly in the two female figures on the right-hand side. So this kind of appropriation is popular throughout the 20th century, and let's look at some examples. If we look at Warhol, you're probably most familiar with the Campbell soup cans. Here he's laying them out in print or lithographic format as you would see them on the shelf of the supermarket, for instance, repeated over and over again. So this idea of repetition works very closely with this idea of mass production of the 20th century, and I think that's what Warhol is going for. But he's also actually just literally lifting or appropriating the image of the Campbell soup can, I think in this case it's chicken soup, chicken noodle, directly from the label. But there was a lot of other kind of appropriation that goes on in his work. He takes the idea of celebrity when it comes to people like Marilyn Monroe, and in this case Elvis Presley, and takes their image and reappropriates it in his art. He was very wrapped up in this idea of celebrity, and that's why he's famous for having coined the phrase, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. And it shows how interested he was in this notion of appropriating the celebrity for his own celebrity. Another type of art celebrity would be Salvador Dali. Here he's appropriating the Mona Lisa. We have that on the left, the standard image of the Mona Lisa, but on the right we have Dali's Mona Lisa, where he takes a lithograph of the image and adds something to it. In this case, it's a beard and a mustache and these letters down on the bottom, which I'll get to in a second. But in appropriating that, he's doing it in a different way. He's taking what he called a ready-made, which is an already existing object. It might be an art object or it might be an everyday object that you would find around the house or anywhere in the world, and reappropriating it as art. Here he's adding a beard and mustache, which interestingly enough, it was going to be published in a magazine, and the version that was sent to Francis Picabia, who was also an artist and publisher of this particular magazine, the version showed up without mustache. And so Picabia added the mustache himself. So he's kind of appropriating on top of Dali's appropriation, which is kind of interesting. Now, the phrase LHOOQ, those letters, have a variety of meanings all wrapped into one. Duchamp was very much a conceptual artist in the early 20th century. On the one hand, it sounds like look, LHOOQ, makes that phonetic sound, which is a little bit of a play on words in the sense that he's appropriating the idea of looking, which we would do at any artwork, but also that phrase in French, LHOOQ, which would sound like this, Elle a chaud à cul, which is she has a hot behind, translated into English. So he's sort of playing on this idea of vulgar expression, which at the same time, when he made this work in 1919, not long after the Mona Lisa was returned after it was stolen, is a kind of appropriation on all of that mythos. Now, when it comes to appropriation of art by other artists, here's a very interesting example. The very young artist Jasper Johns appropriated a de Kooning, William de Kooning artwork. Now, we see the de Kooning artwork on the left, and we see what's called the erased de Kooning by Jasper Johns on the right. So the story is, and it's true, is that Jasper Johns, a young and up-and-coming artist in New York City, knocked on the door of William de Kooning, who knocked on his apartment door and asked if he could have a drawing that he meant to erase, and thereby taking a kind of a ready-made and reappropriating it. And when de Kooning heard this idea, he thought it was pretty interesting, and so he readily gave over one of his drawings to Jasper Johns to erase. Another artist well known for his appropriations would be Roy Lichtenstein. And so what Lichtenstein did is he took images directly from comic books, including the Ben-Day dots, which are the individual little dots that you would see in newspapers that make up the image. So it's not just a painted image. He's actually painting on individual dots. He's appropriating directly from the comic book, sometimes adding his own language or a different phrase or something like that. And what we see on the left in large is that appropriated image, and then I've got a little one on the right where you see that was the piece out of the comic book that he took. Jasper Johns again would appropriate the American flag in a series that he did called Flag, where he's a well-known American iconic image and just repeating it in a variety of different ways. Finally, much closer to home here in British Columbia, we have the photoconceptualist artist Jeff Wall, who was a member of the Vancouver School of Photography. That was a group of artists who studied at Emily Carr, Stan Douglas, Rodney Graham, maybe Ken Lum, and Jeff Wall. They produced a great deal of photoconceptualist art, like this one that Wall called A Sudden Gust of Wind. It's a large-scale photograph that was, I think, early days of Photoshop, where the images got the paper flying off into the wind. I think that's all photoshopped in. Wall was well known for hiring a series of actors and staging his photographs as though they were single shots of a whole movie. It's a very expensive process, but he also became quite famous and sold his work for quite a bit of money. But he was basing in this particular image on something that was very well known in Japanese art of the 19th century, and we'll see it now. Hiroshige, who was a very famous Japanese artist in the 19th century who did a variety of prints that were sent to Europe in the same kind of way the African masks were, and they became very, very popular Japanese prints. And it wasn't just Ken Wall who was doing this kind of appropriation. We can see that kind of direct stealing in the work of Vincent van Gogh. On the right, I think, and the original painting on the left shows us how closely Van Gogh was stealing and appropriating from other artists. So this kind of has a very long history in art production. So when we look at people stealing actual artworks, we should not be surprised when artists do it in a different way themselves. Anyway, this has been sort of just a little peek into some of the content. I hope to see you folks again real soon. Everybody stay safe and healthy, and I'll be offering other courses in the future and hope to see you there.